The US economy is shrinking. Yes, you heard it right. Do you want to know more about the current economical status of the US? Watch the video till the end to learn more about it. Hey guys, welcome back to another interesting episode of Value Add Guy. Today we will be discussing the current economic status of the US, the future economic status, and the reasons for the economy to shrink. So shall we start? Before we start, don't forget the thumbs up. Also, make sure to subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on the post notification to not miss out on any future updates. You might have seen the headlines flashing about how the US economy shrank last quarter for the first time since the pandemic slump struck 2 years ago. It contracted at a 1.4% annual rate, but consumers and businesses kept spending as a sign of economic durability. The news might have brought worries for many. Let us look at the story deeply. So we will start with a piece of good news. Despite the fact that the US economy contracted in the first 3 months of the year and faces risks from high inflation and increasing interest rates, experts expect the economy to expand for the rest of 2022, owing to the strength of the employment market and consumer spending. The Commerce Department reported on Thursday, the 28th of April 2022, that gross domestic product fell 0.4% in the first quarter or 1.4% on an annualized basis. This was a significant drop from the 1.7% growth, 6.9% annualized in the last 3 months of 2021. It was the lowest quarter since the pandemic began. In the fourth quarter of 2021, the nation's overall output of goods and services dropped considerably below the 6.9% annual growth rate. The economy gained 5.7% in 2021 as a whole, the biggest calendar year expansion since 1984. The two most volatile components of quarterly reporting, inventories and foreign commerce, were largely to blame for the drop. Lower government spending slowed growth as well. Underlying demand indicators showed steady expansion. Most importantly, despite the Omicron wave of the coronavirus, which slowed spending on restaurants, travel, and other services in January, consumer spending increased by 0.7% in the first quarter. Slower inventory growth shaved nearly a percentage of GDP growth in the first quarter. Due to supply chain problems, companies rushed to stockpile inventory in late 2021 to avoid having barren shelves over the holiday season. This meant they didn't have to do as much restocking in the new year as they usually did. Meanwhile, the widening trade imbalance cut GDP growth by more than 3 percentage points in the first quarter. Imports are removed from the gross domestic product because they are manufactured elsewhere and have risen sharply in recent months as American consumers have continued to spend. However, exports, which contribute to GDP, have partially lagged due to slower economic development elsewhere. Considering inflation, underlying growth grew 0.6% in the first quarter, excluding the effects of inventories and trade. That represented a modest acceleration from the conclusion of the previous year. The moral of the story is that the Omicron wave, the war of Ukraine, and new lockdowns in China were more costly for growth abroad than they were at home, said Diane Swunk, chief economist for the accounting enterprise Grant Thornton. Domestic spending was remarkably resilient. It actually accelerated. Even though the Federal Reserve aims to boost rates quickly to combat the inflation spike, the sustained spending indicated that the economy might continue to expand this year. Slower restocking of items in stores and warehouses and a steep reduction in exports impeded development in the first quarter. The economy is under stress, raising questions about its fundamental health and fears of a looming recession. As gas and food prices rise, borrowing rates rise. And as we mentioned earlier, the global economy is shaken by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's COVID lockdowns, and people are feeling the pinch. According to experts, the first quarterly drop in GDP is unlikely to signal the start of a recession. That may be of little comfort to President Joe Biden and Democrats, who are facing midterm elections this year, in which Republican opponents will focus on rising costs for food, energy, and other staples. According to the Commerce Department's report released on Thursday, the 28th of April 2022, two phenomena that were important causes of the US economy's drop last quarter are a rise in imports and a decrease in exports. Imports increased by over 20% as Americans splurged on foreign-made products. However, exports fell by nearly 6% as the global economy stalled. And this in turn resulted in a 3.2 percentage point increase in the trade imbalance. According to an assessment of trade statistics issued by the Census Bureau on the 29th of April 2022, Wednesday, demand for foreign petroleum and other industrial items increased in March. At the same time, households purchased more foreign vehicles and other consumer goods. In March, US exports reached a new high of $169.3 billion, while imports, which totaled $294.6 billion, greatly surpassed exports. As a result, the goods trade imbalance rose by over 18% to $125.3 billion last month, a new high. Because the trade deficit is removed from the nation's gross domestic product, these trade movements lowered America's economic growth estimates for the first quarter. After increasing by 1.7% in the fourth quarter of last year, real gross domestic product decreased by 0.4% in the first quarter of 2022. However, the figures represent a variety of economic variables, not all of which are bad. The health of the American economy, which remains stronger than that of most other countries, has boosted import demand. And consumer spending and corporate investment were both strong in the first quarter. However, a slower inventory increase shaved almost a percentage of GDP growth. At the same time, the widening trade deficit detracted more than 3 percentage points. Companies seeking to jam record numbers of consumer products through ports, warehouses and transportation routes encountered many obstacles over the last 2 years as the epidemic drained their labor teams. Congestion in certain supply chain segments, such as the trucking business in the United States, appears to have lessened in recent months. Still, new obstacles have emerged in other areas due to the Ukraine conflict and the coronavirus's worldwide toll. Though Lydia Bozul, lead US economist at Oxford Economics, has said that the report isn't as worrisome as it looks, we cannot avoid the fact that the US economy is in a unique and dangerous situation. In response to the GDP report, Chris Zaccarelli, a chief investment officer for Charlotte Independent Advisor Alliance, said today's shock drop in GDP is a wake-up call that the economy isn't as strong as we all thought. The job market, which is the most important pillar of the economy, remains vital. The unemployment rate is near a 50-year low of 3.6% and the wages are rising steadily. And in the January-March quarter, businesses and consumers increased their spending at a 3.7% annual rate after adjusting for inflation. Seasonally adjusted new jobless claims fell to 180,000 last week, slightly higher than the more than 50-year low of 166,000 last month, March. As a result of labor shortages, firms have been clinging to their employees at historically low rates. Wages are constantly growing as businesses strive to attract and keep employees, which has helped consumers preserve their spending power. These developments, according to economists, are a stronger indicator of the economy's core strength than the latest GDP statistic. Nonetheless, substantial dangers have surfaced. Supply chain disruptions are still a pandemic-era reality in China and elsewhere. The war in Ukraine is adding to rising prices, eroding consumer spending power. Prices rose 8.5% from a year ago in the last month, the fastest increase in 4 decades. We are at a turning point in the economy, said Gregory Dago, chief economist at tax advisory firm EY Parthenon. The pace of growth is moderating. The poor performance in the first quarter contrasts with the strong recovery from the epidemic last year, which was powered in part by massive government help and ultra-low lending rates. As stimulus checks and other government subsidies have expired, consumer spending has dropped from its scorching pace in the first half of last year. President Biden's major political message is further weakened by the negative GDP estimate from the previous quarter. According to the president, rapid growth is a counterbalance to rising inflation. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and an increase in COVID cases worldwide are impacting the economy and rising inflationary pressures. Due to complicated supply chains, many businesses are still having trouble obtaining the components and materials they require. However, the Plano, Texas-based burger chain Muya has come up with business tactics to overcome the shortage of workers. Even though they face higher costs for meat, buns, and packaging supplies, they have raised wages to attract and keep workers. Just about every aspect of doing business has gotten significantly more expensive, said Doug Wilmarth, the company's president. Muya hopes to launch 20 additional restaurants this year, despite supply chain issues related to the epidemic. "We are big believers in American consumers and the American economy," he said. According to the International Monetary Fund, the global economy will develop more slowly this year. Global growth is expected to fall to 3.6% this year, down from 6.1% last year due to the Ukraine conflict and COVID. Consumers are altering their spending patterns as the epidemic fades and increasing food and gas costs bite into household budgets, according to Thursday's GDP data. Clothing, fuel and grocery spending declined in the first quarter after accounting for inflation. On the other hand, Americans spent more on services such as travel and dining out. The Fed had hoped that such a change would lower inflation, given that goods prices had risen faster than services in the previous year. However, plane tickets, hotel rooms, and restaurant meals are now increasing in price. Now let us see how the White House has responded to the first quarter growth decline. The White House rejected a drop in first quarter growth caused by an anomaly in inventories and increased imports, pointing to underlying strength in consumer spending in Thursday's gross domestic product data. While last quarter's growth estimate was affected by technical factors, the United States confronts the challenges of COVID-19 around the world. Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and global inflation from a position of strength. President Biden stated in a statement following the release, referring to President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia. Mr. Biden also stated that consumer spending, business investment, and residential investment increased at strong rates. Mr. Biden and the Democrats are facing a difficult midterm election year, with inflation at its worst level in 4 decades, eroding household budgets and consumer confidence. At the same time, the Federal Reserve is rising interest rates in an attempt to prevent quick price gains from becoming permanent, which may cause the economy to begin to cool significantly just before voters go to the polls. The administration has blamed high inflation on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. While the conflict has increased the price of gas and other commodities, inflation was already high before Russia's intervention. At the hair salon and the frozen food aisle, Americans have felt the effects of inflation. While shopping for pet food, pantry essentials, and even diapers, they have seen it. Gas is straining them, to be sure. However, the cost of bacon is also high. According to a poll done by Morning Consult in mid-February for The Upshot, nearly 9 out of 10 Americans have seen rising costs around them. When asked which price hikes had attracted their notice, many people listed basics like petrol, milk, ground beef, and bread. A vastly different universe of things from the limited collection of commodities that were flying in price last spring, such as second-hand vehicles and raw timber. Even in a period of tremendous employment and economic development, the poll results reveal why consumers remain pessimistic. Inflation has become unavoidable. For the first time in almost 4 decades, Americans rank inflation among the top concerns as opting out becomes increasingly difficult. The issue hangs over President Biden's legislative program and the Democrats' chances in the November elections in Washington. The monthly announcement of official inflation numbers has become a tense political event, with inflation hitting a 40-year high on Thursday, fueled by rising petrol and food costs. Sanctions on Russia, which are already rocking the global economy, now threaten to increase oil and food prices. Many people cited reducing the heat this winter to save money, limiting costs like family trips and restaurant meals, and deferring house repair work as coping mechanisms. People revealed their coping tactics, which included comparative shopping, bulk purchasing, and in some cases simply doing without. In some respects, the replies reveal that consumers view inflation differently from policymakers and statisticians. Even though people's replies covered the whole economy, they primarily focused on two categories: gasoline and food. The two are excluded from the core consumer price index, which Washington officials use to determine whether inflation increases too rapidly. The rich can live effortless for now, but the young, economically backwards, are struggling. So now that has been for the day. What do you think about the American inflation? Do you think the government is taking the issue lightheartedly? Please state your views in the comment box below. Before we say our goodbyes, don't forget the thumbs up if you loved the video. Also, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the post notification to not miss out on any future updates. So until the next video, goodbye.